Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to another Oxford University Air Squadron video. This one's entitled Book Clubs and Bombers. Apologies for the PT kit. I finally built up enough inertia to take on one of Sergeant Brister's challenges today. So I'm going to go and video that straight after this. So hence the PT kit, I do apologise. The video today then, not a standard lecture as such. This video is inspired by a book club that Officer Cadet Kelly ran for us last week. Thank you again, Aoife, for that. It was really good. And we looked at a book called A God in Ruins, which is about a fictional account of a Halifax pilot in the Second World War. I absolutely love this book. It's the best depiction, even though it's fictional, of the life of a bomber pilot. And it raised some really good questions. There were questions from the students, questions from myself as well. So it got me thinking, maybe we use this as a stepping stone to do something else. What I would like to do, I would like to do an air power case study with you all. This is the kind of challenge that I'm setting you today. I would like to do an air power case study to assess the contribution of the RAF's bombing campaign to victory in Europe during World War II. Once again, I would like to assess the contribution of the RAF's bombing campaign to victory in Europe during World War II. Quite pertinent as well, since we've just gone through VE Day recently. Few key words in there. Assess. I want you to actually assess the RAF's contribution. So what does that mean? I don't want you just to tell me what it is. I don't want a history lesson, okay? I want your opinion. I want some assessment in there. I want some evaluation. So to do that, you've got to have some stats. You've got to have some figures. You've got to have some information some data that you are going to assess and evaluate. I want you to focus, if you can, on the RAF's bombing campaign. Obviously, it was the Allied bomber offensive, but I want you to focus on the RAF's contribution for the most part. Obviously, victory in Europe and World War II is your temporal setting. So that is the challenge I'm going to set you. Very kindly, APO Lagarde has volunteered to lead a team to achieve this. Piers has just finished his exams, so he's got a bit of free time. Say free time, he's got more space in his calendar than he would normally have. Now, I know some of you as well, the Reading lot and others, have also just finished your exams. If that's the case and you have a bit of time to help Piers out, okay? But he's going to be the team lead on this. Your maximum time limit allowed is 45 minutes. If you want to use all of that for a presentation, that's up to you. I would like some Q&A. Be creative. If you don't need 45 minutes, don't take it. But I want that assessment. I want that higher level of interrogation of the data and the information. There may or may not be special guests, be warned. There may be Air Force guests, there may be university guests that the boss chooses to invite. So nudge, nudge, wink, wink, make sure this is your best effort, okay? You might have other people involved in the Zoom call who you might not expect. The ability to gather a load of information, make it into a credible presentation to argue a viewpoint is not an easy skill. It's a skill we practice and I saw quite frequently at the Defence Academy at Shrivenham when I worked there. It's a skill you'll practice at initial officer training at Cranwell. It's also a skill that you're all going to need when you go on to employment, whatever career you go into. Now, what we've seen through COVID is that things like Zoom calls and doing stuff remotely is going to be a new way of working for us while social distancing measures are in place, which could be for quite a long time. So this is a skill you need to know, okay? So get together, get your head in the game and develop this the new skill set. We've got a lot of talent out there, okay? You've got historians like Officer Cadet Paget, you've got social scientists, Officer Cadet Kelly, you've got different skills, use them, reach out to these people and get it done together, and then it's not too much work, and I definitely don't want Piers to carry the majority of this on his shoulders. Okay then, so I've highlighted that there are certain skills that will be useful to you in the wider employment area, but we in the military are very keen to use case studies and things and use those higher skill sets of assessment and evaluation regarding military case studies because it just point blank makes you a better officer. Also, if it's air power related, it's going to make you a better Air Force officer if you can understand your weapon system. You can understand the tactics, the strategies that are employed with air power. That is only going to make you a better officer in the future. You will practice these skills at IAT, you will practice at Shrivenham. So this is just a good rehearsal for the future. And as Michael Howard says, it is just going to make you more confident in your profession. Michael Howard, incidentally, is probably the greatest British military historian there's ever been. Google him, not the politician, the military historian. Lots of fascinating stuff comes up. To that end, one of his most famous articles in 1961 was called The Use and Abuse of Military History. For historians, you'll probably have seen this article. It's fantastic. And it says that to study, there's a nuance to studying military history if you want to do it properly, and if you want it to be useful to the future. History doesn't repeat itself, only historians do. So to use military history in the correct way to make yourself better in your chosen vocation in the military is a subtle skill that takes some learning. But the 3 top tips he has from this article to help you with these case studies is that you must study in width, depth, and context. Now, by width, what he's saying is an appropriate temporal time period. For us, that's more than likely going to be 1939 to 1945. However, if you want to take a more liberal view on that, that's absolutely fine with me. If you want to go back to the bombing theories that Trenchard brought in after the First World War and how they influenced the makeup of the bomber force that went to war in 1939, that's cool with me. But it's up to you, but give yourself a temporal time frame, set your width before you get into this, okay? You're not just looking at one point in history, you are looking at a span. Bomber Command changed its in shape and character throughout the war, okay? So pick your span, and that assessment is going to take in the whole span of the campaign, okay? Depth. Depth is key. I cannot stress this enough, a recounting of what the Wikipedia page says on this, okay? I do not want a historical review of what other people have said. I want some assessment. So to do that, you're going to need multiple sources. Now, they don't need to be primary sources. We're limited on time here. I would like you to achieve this within a month, within 4 weeks of me setting it. So we haven't got time for you to dig into the archives and get primary sources, but there's some great secondary sources out there on the internet and elsewhere, some great YouTube videos, but pick a few sources to give yourself some depth. Pick some quotes, attribute them, pick some statistics and some graphs. One of the reasons we study the strategic bomber offensive is that it is one of the most well-studied bomber campaigns ever. The US Strategic Bomber Survey is a must for this. Pages and pages and pages of data to actually back up the evidence. Lots of statistics, lots of data. As we've seen with COVID-19, statistics are really, really important to making an argument. However, they have to be used with due caution, okay? So if you can find a reputable statistics source like the US Strategic Bomber Survey, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, use it. Context. Context is key for me, so we're going to spend a bit more time talking about context. I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs. You know that the 3 levels of war are tactical, operational, and strategic. Tactical, the actual fighting of the war, air-to-air combat, etc. Operational, the planning of battles and campaigns, the Battle of Britain, for example. Strategic is that big, overarching view where politics and military meet, and we decide the direction of the war as a whole. Now, you're doing an assessment of the effect of strategic bombing as a whole. You're going to be at that strategic level. As Colin Gray says, who's one of the masters in strategic thinking in his book, The Strategy Bridge, the meaning and character of strategies are driven by their contexts, all of which are constantly in play. What this means in short, context is key, especially when we're looking at that strategic level, which you will be rooted in to answer this question. So we must get into the context. There's a useful tool which also partly comes from Gray and partly comes from something called the pestle model, which they use at ICSC to teach squadron leaders, which the boss is familiar with. But the Defence Academy is a tool that is used in the humanities to study a case study suitable to generate that context, okay? I'm going to talk through the individual elements really quickly, and I would strongly advise you use a model like this and people's individual disciplines within the squadron to tick off these areas to make sure that you've got the context right for what you're talking about. The first one is the political context. Obviously really important with the bomber offensive. Who were the key political figures at that time? What political pressure was they're being applied? Early in the war, Britain was on her own. The Americans weren't even there. So we had to be seen to be doing something. The British people needed to be seen and needed a win. That's a lot of what the Dam Busters raids were about, because we'd just gone through the Blitz. We were constantly under the Nazi jackboot. We needed to fight back. And all we had, because we didn't have a large standing army, and the Navy was doing everything it could to keep Britain resupplied, but it couldn't take the offensive on land. So the Air Force was what we had. So we used Bomber Command for that. Then later in the war, obviously a lot of pressure came from Stalin. He wanted a Western Front opened up. The Americans and we weren't ready with the land armies. So Bomber Command was what we had. So have a look at the political pressures that we're applying to your case study. They are important. What were the economic pressures? Obviously, this is really key for the strategic bomber offensive, because that is arguably one of the aims, was to cripple the economy. But Albert Speer was an absolute genius. Did they actually cripple the economy? This was a question that came up in the book club. And actually, the answer was probably no. The German economy was growing throughout. So what were the economic aims? What were the economic impacts? And there's a very good book by Phillips O'Brien, Why the War Was Won, that talks, his theory is that actually the only reason we won the war wasn't tactical or strategic brilliance. It was the fact we had a bigger economy. We could outproduce the Germans. That's the only reason we won, because we had a bigger economy. So an interesting point of view to take in your assessment. Society. How scared were we? We talk about the Blitz spirit, but how scared were people? Were the moral effects 20-1, which Trenchard used to talk about, were they true, the profits of air power used to speak about, or were they vastly overplayed? Were people quite resilient to bombing? Was the World War I reaction to the Gotha raids actually an overestimation of what we saw in World War II? The people's reaction to this is very, very important, especially when you link it to theorists like Douay. Technology. What technology did we have? How did technological developments affect the campaign? The Norden bomb site, how accurate was it? The Butt report said it wasn't very accurate at the start of the war, at about 1940. So how more accurate did it get with things like oboe, G, HS2? Look at these key technologies if you want to. I know it's a tactical level, but it does affect the overall impact of the campaign. Environment and geography. Okay, so what environment were we fighting in? What weathers were we fighting in? We had to go over the North Sea. What distances were we talking about? How far could the aircraft go at that time? Don't discount the geography and its impact on the strategic context. Legal. There are huge legal ramifications and ethical ramifications on the bomber campaign. Area bombardment, bombing the houses of the factory workers. Was this ever ethically justifiable? Now be very, very careful that you look at this in the context of the time. Do not take our moral and ethical opinions from today and put them onto bomber crews of then. That's not fair, okay? Look at the strategic context at the time and what they thought. And actually, also remember what the bomber crews thought they were doing. They thought they were winning the war. They hadn't read the Butt report. They didn't know how ineffectual, arguably, some of this bombing was, okay? So don't forget the legal ramifications. Military. Now, when you look at the military, numbers of bombers, types of fighters, impact they had on it, air defense radars. When you look at these things, be careful that you don't look purely at us. Got to look at the Luftwaffe too. What did they and didn't they have? What was their air defense like? You've got to red team it. You must assess that strategic context in both sides of the house, the Allies and the Luftwaffe. History. I've already mentioned this. Strategic bomber theories from World War I and the formation of the Air Force going into World War II had an impact on the way that the strategic bomber campaign panned out. History, before the temporal period you look at, might actually be relevant to the strategic context you start in. So have a look at that. But that's just a rough framework, take it or leave it, and you can see the pestle model in those letters that's used. But at this point, it's over to you, okay? I challenge you. Let's make a great case study and show what we've got. Let's build those skills. Over to you.